I am going to go ahead and kick us off. Welcome to another month, another Friday of FOIA Friday, another awesome guest, Philip Eil. We're going to talk a lot about his book, Prescription for Pain, and the countless hours of research and interviews and worrying about one big FOIA request and its lawsuit that went into that. Phil, do you want to introduce yourself more formally?
Sure. First off, thank you so much for having me, Dylan. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm a longtime fan of Muck Rock, longtime user of Muck Rock. They didn't pay me to say that. Um, I'm a freelance journalist based in my hometown of Providence, Rhode Island, where I'm zooming in from today. Um, I've had a pretty eclectic career in journalism that spans about 15 years. I was the news editor and staff writer at a alt-weekly newspaper called the Providence Phoenix for the paper's last 18 months between 2013 and 2014 when it closed. I've since written for a number of newspapers, websites, magazines, the Boston Globe, Vice, The Atlantic, Columbia Journalism Review, and my debut book, many years in the making, Prescription for Pain: How a Once Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Killer, came out last April in 2024 from Steerforth Press, now out in paperback. And I am continuing to work as a journalist, working on some other stories now. And yeah, I'm just delighted to be here. Always happy to chat about FOIA.
Awesome. Well, if you've been on this call before, you know the run of the show is usually that I start sharing some notes about what we're going to talk about today with lots of links and goodies. That is not going to happen this week. I was pushing to make a deadline for a story that published this morning, so I don't have my show notes as usual. I do have some links I'm going to share in the chat. And I'm going to get started in the conversation with Phil after walking through a related project about opioid settlement spending.
Mm.
I've been working with some students at the University of West Virginia to file requests at or towards every single county in West Virginia to ask for the checks, the ledgers, the receipts of how they're spending the $1 billion that is going to West Virginia in opioid payout money from the industry giants. Um, so I'm going to quickly share my screen, walk a little bit through that. Then we're going to come back to Phil and dig into the book and the good stuff. But just humor me for a second. I want to share this project with y'all because we want to eventually expand this to other states. And if any of you are in other states where you're interested in filing similar requests, I'm going to share a link to join the Data Liberation Project um, channel Slack in our Muckrock Slack so that you can get tuned in or reach out to me there and tell me what state you live in, and we can start working on filing some requests there. Um, so first, if you want a little bit more detail than I'm going to give you before I start our chat with Phil, here's a webinar that I did earlier this week with a nonprofit called Reporting on Addiction. They do what their name is. They help reporters report on addiction and build different tools and guides for that. So I gave a little bit longer version of this conversation earlier this week. Um, but just as a little bit of background, like many states, West Virginia is getting a lot of money from the industry giants to go down to the county level. A lot of reporters in different states have covered how much their state has gotten. What's really interesting, though, at least for us, is when that money gets down to the county level, how is it going to be spent? Who's making those decisions? And does the public really know what that money is going to be spent on? There's been a lot of great reporting about this. They're finding some what seems to be less useful cases of how counties are spending. Mountain State Spotlight wrote this story last year, last summer, about how Jackson County was already spending, I think, around the $500,000 that it was allocated on a center for training first responders and law enforcement, and over $300,000 there went to a shooting range. And so we were interested with this class at West Virginia University, or University of West Virginia, to go to counties and ask for all the documentation that they have of what they've spent so far. I'm going to drop this link in the chat in a second after I'm done talking. But here's what the language for that looked like. It was pretty extensive for any funds that they've received, any applications received, forced that spending. Any documentation of how the funds are awarded, any documents about future plans for the use of funds. And we've got about 45 responses back with documents that we can actually see the agency has either spent money or plans to spend money in specific ways and have put those into a public document cloud project. So also, if you live in West Virginia, and you're interested in this, um, take a look at this document cloud project I'm going to drop in the chat. We have it organized by county, so you can click a county and see what all documents we have for that single county. For example, Mingo, I think we have like three or four. Here's what they gave us. You can also search through the documents if you're interested in saying, I don't know, what maybe there's anything that's spent on recovery programs, um, what documents have anything about recovery programs in it. Um, so take a look also if you're interested in filing this in other states. It gives you an idea of what you could get back at the county level. Like I said, we've gotten ledgers, checks, just emails saying this is how much they've spent, lots of other sorts of documents. It's unfortunately not as pretty and easy as just getting a spreadsheet of all the spending from each county. Um, we're going to work in the next couple months to try to pull out the data in these different documents like checks and ledgers and get it into a tabular form. So I'll keep you updated all on that. But I just wanted to share that while we're talking about the opioid crisis today. There is this project we're doing and are going to try to continue in different states. And we'd love you to be involved. So hit me up over email, or I'll share in a second the Slack channel you can join to get involved in the data liberation project, where we're hoping to get a few other volunteers involved in this as well. So let
And
me grab the
just
link.
to interject briefly, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dylan, because it's really hard. My book tells the story of an individual doctor in one place at one time, but it's hard to overstate the scale and the scope of the opioid epidemic. OxyContin, which is widely recognized as kind of the beginning of it when it was released, comes out in the mid 90s, almost 30 years ago now. And this has touched every corner of the country and beyond the country. And there are rightfully many, many books about the opiate epidemic, many great books. And my book is just one piece of that broader story. So I always emphasize, and we can talk more about how, this is a huge story affecting really every corner of the country in myriad different ways.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I felt in your book was this really eerie feeling of how this was spreading across the country or
Yeah.
becoming a bigger and bigger problem, and we were seeing one world of how that was happening, which is
Yep.
kind of a scary thing because seemed terrible just to read about all the people that had touched Folkman's life in different ways and
Yeah.
been injured or died. And I just had the sense that this was expanding and expanding out even as we were seeing this like one case of it.
Yep.
Um, so let's hop right in. Do you want to just give a kind of a brief background on the book first, or just the premise, what it covers,
Sure.
where it goes?
Sure. So to tell the brief background to the story, let's go back to 2009 when I am 23 years old. I'm recently out of college. I have just decided I've been bitten by the journalism bug. I want to pursue journalism. I had recently read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, which was one of the books that made me want to be a writer and made me want to pursue true crime stories in particular. And at this time, I learned somewhat by coincidence of an old, long lost college and medical school classmate of my dad. Now, my dad, Charles Eil, is still today a practicing endocrinologist in Fall River, Massachusetts. He's slowly winding his way toward retirement. He is a mild-mannered guy. He wears glasses. He sings in civic choir groups. He reads books. He plays golf. Not the kind of guy I, or probably you, would expect to know someone who was accused of a massive prescription drug dealing scheme. But that is what I learned at the time, that this old classmate of my dad, Paul Volkman, MD, PhD, was charged with a massive multi-year prescription drug dealing scheme that, according to prosecutors, took place in southern Ohio out of cash only pain clinics that prescribed enormous amounts of controlled substances, including opiates, including sedatives like Valium and muscle relaxers. According to prosecutors, Volkman had been indicted in 2007. When I learned about the case, he hadn't gone to trial yet. This scheme lasted for years. It made a lot of money for the folks involved. And perhaps most importantly, a lot of folks died as a result of apparent overdoses. Folks who had gone to these clinics, paid cash to see the doctor, and taken the medications as prescribed, or not as prescribed, and died as a result from overdoses. So I hear about this, and I'm this young, ambitious journalist, not a lot of experience, but a lot of excitement. And I say, what on earth happened to this guy? And how is it possible that my dad knows this guy? And what's the story here? And so, to make a very long story short, on and off for the next 15 years, I reported on the story. I interviewed Volkman in person. I corresponded with him after his conviction. I traveled to Southern Ohio, namely the town of Portsmouth, which is right on the Ohio River, one of the worst hit areas in the country by the opioid epidemic. And eventually I put the story together and told the story in the book from A to Z. What happened to from what the story of Paul Volckman was, how he wound up from a high school valedictorian and an MD PhD from the University of Chicago to working in sketchy cash only non-hospital affiliated pain clinics in Southern Ohio, what his crimes were, what the effect of his crimes were, and what the judicial process was in this case. It led to an extraordinary sentence of 4 consecutive life terms in prison, which Volkman is still serving. He's now at a federal prison in Arizona. And as far as I can tell, among the hundreds of doctors charged and convicted of similar crimes during the opioid epidemic, no sentence matches or exceeds that. It's a high watermark for consecutive life sentences. So I try to tell that story from as many angles as possible about Volkman, about the people he affected, and about the place where it occurred. And as we will discuss, the reporting wasn't always easy or smooth and involved a major unexpected Freedom of Information Act battle.
And I think one of the things I've been thinking about with your book is that Volkman and the other people involved in his scheme, the narratives change as they recall what happened and often refute each other.
Yeah,
And this makes primary sources like the ones that you were able to get in the book so important. Um, and one of the things I was wondering is like, at what point did you realize that primary sources would have that role? Because in my primary sources, I mean documents and things like things you could get through FOIA requests,
yeah.
but also different types of documents to verify the events of Volkmann's life, especially leading up to the pill mill time period. Um, One of the things I think about is your first conversations with him when you were a
Yeah,
younger reporter,
yeah,
and you were just kind of parsing out the story,
yeah,
and he had his narrative of what happened, and it would
yeah.
be quite a while until you started to unfold everything else behind his narrative.
Yeah, well, just let me start by answering, just giving folks an idea of the documents the story is built on, that kind of, as you say, form the backbone of the story. Um, it's not an exaggeration to say there are tens of thousands of pages of documents that or at least thousands of pages that I sifted through for the course of this book. I mean, in his criminal trial alone, so yet another reason why this case stands out is that most doctors or most criminal defendants of any kind, when charged with crimes, take a plea deal and their case never goes to trial. Volkman, who throughout the time I knew him and still to this day, as far as I know, maintains his innocence, states that he was a compassionate, conscientious doctor who was treating the medical needs of his patients in an informed way and doing things by the book, and that he is a victim of a out of control law enforcement apparatus. That's his version. He refused a plea deal. And so that decision wound up being significant for him and for my book because it meant that this case went to a trial, and trials produce a lot of documents. This was an 8-week federal trial in Cincinnati in 2011. 80 witnesses testified, 70 for the prosecution, 10 for the defense. The transcript alone was thousands of pages, and then there were additional thousands of pages of the evidence that was shown in the course of that trial. Prescription slips, autopsy reports, videos from inside the clinic, photos from inside the clinic, all kinds of other documents about the investigation and the crimes. And even if you zoom out even further, before Volkman even gets into criminal trouble, he had had a number of run-ins with the medical malpractice system. And so there were a number of malpractice cases against him in his life before he gets into pain management or drug dealing, depending on how you view it. And I dug into those cases as well, many of, which produced a lot of documents too. Surprise, he claims that he was innocent in those cases as well, despite the fact that two of them went to trial and verdicts against him. These are malpractice cases, and two others were settled by his insurers. So, and that's not even all the documents I used in the book, but it's a lot of them. To answer your question, I didn't necessarily know how big of a role documents would play. Because when I started working on this story in 2009, one of the very first things I did was send him a letter asking if I could interview him. I was beginning a nonfiction MFA program in New York, and I knew this was a big story that I could work on there. And I sent Volkman a letter asking if I could interview him. And he agreed. And I talk about this in the book. A few months later, I drove out to Chicago in December of 2009. It was one of the first interviews I did for the project at all, was with the guy at the center of it. I often joke, had he talked to his lawyer and said, should I talk to this graduate student with a tape recorder in hand for hours on end? They probably would have advised him against it, but he wasn't the kind of guy who was going to do that. So at that time, I just knew I had a hell of a story. I was pretty inexperienced, but I knew this guy was talking to me. And I, at that point, didn't really have any of the documents, with the exception of maybe the indictment. Um, it was as I went and as I collected more information from him, and as I went to Southern Ohio, and much later as I looked into the malpractice cases, and then when the trial happened, that it actually wasn't probably until I really began to write it that the structure of kind of offering his version of events and then the best available factual version of events using documents kind of came to me. That seemed to me to be the best way to approach the story. And that's what I do in the book. I present his version of events or the version of him and other unreliable narrators. And then I, to the extent I can, go to what the facts say, what other people say, what the documents say.
And can you give as an example, just like a summary of some of those first malpractice cases? Because I feel like that for our listeners may paint a clear picture
Sure.
of what's to come, and I think that's how you're able to do it in the book, is you start to realize this the kind of trends of how he acts, and then how he justifies it afterwards.
Right. So Volkmann's period of alleged criminal activity is from 2003 to 2006. And by that time, he was already in his mid 50s. He was a grown up. He had had a medical career of decades. And so, in the first section of the book, before all that, to explain how he got there, I dive into that part of his life and his career. And he had an unusual medical career. He and my dad both attended this MD PhD program at the University of Chicago called the Medical Scientist Training Program. There are similar versions of this federally funded at schools around the country. It's basically intended, who knows if it's still funded under Doge. I haven't checked that, but The idea was to produce scientists, medical scientists who would conduct research and push the body of medical knowledge about diseases, about treatments forward. As it turned out, both Volkman and my dad ultimately left academia for different reasons. Volkman flamed out pretty early on for reasons that he say were one thing and other people say were another, a theme. He goes into pediatrics in Chicago and has a somewhat successful pediatrics office, but finds that he's not making enough money to provide for him and his family. So he starts moonlighting in local emergency rooms on nights and weekends, and ultimately expands that to taking temporary emergency room gigs around the Midwest, what are called locum tenens gigs, which is kind of a fancy term for temp work for doctors. So, over the course of about 20 years, between his work as a pediatrician and his work as a traveling emergency room doctor, he sued a few times. In one instance, at his pediatrics office, a really tragic story. Parents bring their 1-year-old child to the office who hasn't slept well the night before. The child develops a very quick and severe breathing issue called epiglottitis, swelling of the windpipe area. And Volkman makes a fateful decision that he is not going to allow the child to be transported to a local emergency room to be treated. He believes he needs to intubate, that is, implant a breathing tube into the child in the office. This does not work for reasons that are under dispute. He claims the EMTs brought him faulty equipment. Other people say this was a horrible idea. He should have never tried this there. There was time for this child to go to the local emergency room. That case results in the child's death ultimately, and a lawsuit against him that goes to a jury trial and a significant verdict against him. In other cases, which are from his time in ER medicine, there are just instances where people have bad outcomes. A woman loses her arm after an issue with her arm goes undertreated. A guy has a brain bleed that is underdiagnosed and he's not given the right care and he has severe issues. A older woman who's living at a uh, nursing home has an issue with a feeding tube that it's been installed in her stomach that gets reinstalled and causes internal damage. And there's disputes in each case about was he involved in this bad outcome as the emergency room doctor who saw these patients. And in each case, he claims no, his treatment was great. He was the victim of sleazy lawyers who were out to make a buck. And he says the malpractice case is tilted against doctors. And so I examine the specific claims in the lawsuit and the outcome, and also examine the broader claim of, were these lawyers sleazy? Is the playing field in malpractice cases tilted against doctors? And I try the best I can to make some sense out of these very complicated cases, often using documents.
And I think one of the kind of most shocking moments as I was reading that was the details you had about how, if I remember correctly, the child's death, that original call was made to someone at a hospital who later gets another call uh, related to Volkman uh, deciding to perform some sort of operation that's going to be dangerous. And she's terrified because she's like, this doctor messed it up the first time, and I'm aware of his hubris and his carelessness. And basically, she directs her nurses to go on like a secret mission to get the patient out of his care.
Yeah. So in the course of reporting the story of the child with the breathing issue, in each case, I had some documents, varying amounts for these malpractice lawsuits, which were 20 or more years in the past in kind of obscure small towns around the Midwest. And in each case, I tried to my best to report out what I could, picked names from the documents and tried to contact these people. In that case, this woman was running a response for a local children's hospital in Chicago that dealt with kind of heavy duty cases. And she had received Volkman's call that day. And by coincidence, fortuitous coincidence for me, when I interviewed her, she said, I had this other run-in with Dr. Volkman later on when he was working at a emergency room in Indiana. And she described that time where she was part of the transport team that would take children who needed care that was beyond what a local emergency room could provide and get them to the children's hospital. And she described this harrowing incident where this child was at a hospital experiencing some kind of asthma attack, but not needing a ton of care. It was a situation that was fairly in hand. And according to her, she watched as Volkman said this child needed like intracardiac an EpiPen to the chest, basically, which horrified everyone around. It struck them as a completely heavy-handed, over-the-top treatment, and they basically had to resort to subterfuge to kind of like sending one nurse off to go pretend to ask a question and kind of whisking the child away to safety away from Volkman. So I include that story as in this first section of the book, where I'm painting a picture of who this guy was before he arrived in Southern Ohio.
In that, I think in that time in the book, you can really feel, like I said, the hubris and the carelessness and how that's also colliding with this feeling he has that he's not making enough money and that his family is not living a comfortable lifestyle for some reason, despite that one would think that that's not true.
Yeah, and just to mention a brief public record story from this part of the story and to show how I kind of use public records, Volkman later on, when he was first arrested for his crimes in Ohio, would write in a letter to a judge that he had never had any actions by a state medical board against him. That was in his letter pleading for release after his initial arrest. And here's an example of something that's semi, but not really true. Because following the incident with the child in Chicago, I made a Illinois state public records request to the Department of Medical Regulation. I'm forgetting the exact name to see if they had anything about this instance. And as it turned out, they had in fact issued a complaint against his license that describes after this event in the 80s that describes his behavior as reckless and endangering the child, and they sought to suspend or fully revoke his license. As it turned out, and I didn't have the ability to access the proceedings that led to him not facing any real punishment in Illinois. I don't know how he got away with it, but somehow he did. But at the very least, I used Illinois state records to show that his claim of having no action against him was bogus. He actually had a very serious action against him. His home state's medical board had tried to pause or revoke his license. So that's just an example of the way, and actually in the center photo section of the book, I include an excerpt from that very document because it's so powerful, the language that the medical board uses.
Yeah, and I hope for people listening they can get the feeling of how urgent it is to have primary sources, documents to uh, investigate all these kind of confusing details of what happened in really urgent scenarios where someone's life was on the line, a child's life was on the line, and then afterward, yeah, go
And
ahead.
since you mentioned that, Dylan, I hadn't thought of this, but I spent on and off 15 years on this book, and it was a really intimidating story because I was writing about a guy who has an MD and a PhD, and who was not shy about telling you how much smarter and better qualified he was than virtually everyone. And even if I didn't come to respect him, I don't have those degrees. Who am I to say that he is in fact a criminal or a hack? And if I didn't have primary source records, I don't think I would have never been able to do that. I mean, I would have interviewed people, and that would have been nice, but I think to be able to have these documents to point to helped me to assuage some of the anxiety I had about stepping toe to toe with this guy who was so much older, more experienced, more educated than me, and to really show where he was not telling the truth or where his actions had caused harm, um, according to people other than just Phil Eil, journalist.
Yeah, and his belief that he is that much smarter than everyone else, I think that could have dissuaded you from the story when in fact that became the story of just how much smarter he thinks he is than everyone else and how that continually led to the sort of recklessness and carelessness that you would see in the documents.
Yeah.
So I want to bring us to the big lawsuit. Uh Tell me about that. Tell me about the request, what the rejection felt like, and how you ended up in the lawsuit.
Okay, so I started working on the story in 2009. I interviewed Volkman. As it turned out, although I didn't notice at the time, 4 years elapsed between his indictment in 2007 and the beginning of his trial in 2011. And he spends most of that time free living his life in Chicago. And I interviewed him during that time. The case goes to trial in March of 2011. And as I mentioned, it's an extensive major trial that the government brings a lot of firepower to. They call 70 witnesses, hundreds of exhibits. The crux of the trial was, is this guy a doctor or a drug dealer? The defense claims he was a doctor, that he was helping people in pain, that there's an epidemic of undertreated chronic pain in this country, and he was serving some of the most vulnerable people who were, living in a down and out part of Ohio and had various injuries and ailments. And he was not only innocent, but actually commendable because he was treating people in pain who had been failed by the medical system. That's the defense's narrative. The prosecution's narrative is he's a drug dealer hiding behind a white coat and fanning the flames of an area that has a really bad prescription drug problem. So that was the narrative. A lot of experts called, a lot of firsthand witnesses called, former patients, former employees, family members of loved ones, former patients who had passed away, coroners, forensic toxicologists, law enforcement, lots and lots of witnesses, lots and lots of evidence. And of course, after this ends, I, who am keen to write about this story, am planning on using the record from this trial. It is, I know that the trial is going to be a centerpiece of my story, and I know that it's going to be very hard to write about the trial without the records. As it turns out, there are really two versions of a trial record. One is the transcript, one is the evidence. I naively didn't expect much of a hassle in getting my hands on either one. That turned out to be wrong on both accounts. The transcript is harder because it takes a while to get ordered. If you order portions of it yourself, as opposed to simply downloading it from Pacer after somebody else has ordered it, there's a major difference in cost between like $3 per page and like 10 cents per page. And even 10 cents per page, if it's thousands of pages of documents, is no small thing. But I, for certain parts of this case, ordered the kind of raw transcript myself, like the opening arguments of the trial, and had to pay the full lawyer fee of like $3, which is a separate transparency conversation. Ultimately, I did, and the transcript doesn't come in one neatly organized A to Z thing. It's like cobbled together in pieces, and you have to piece it together. And so transcripts aren't as easy. That was a challenge in and of itself. But the real challenge was the evidence from the trial, which I knew were hundreds of individual exhibits that mainly had been shown to the jury to prove that Volkman was in fact a drug dealer. I would learn that there were tens of thousands of pages of material. And when the trial ended, I stand by the fact that I don't think this should have been a FOIA case. It wound up being a FOIA case, but I, having grown up seeing trial evidence mentioned in true crime documentaries and even on the evening news during, high-profile trials, there have even, because I became somewhat of an expert in this, in some cases of high-profile federal prosecutions, prosecutors will make a website where they upload the documents so you can access them themselves. There was a 9/11, a prosecution related to 9/11 where they did that. For a long time, it was in the District of Virginia, a U.S. Department of Justice website where you could access the documents. So I figure, I'll just ask the clerks and I'll get it. Didn't happen. I asked everyone at the ground level, so to speak, if I could access the evidence, and they all said no. The clerk of the court said no. The clerk of the appellate court said no. The prosecutor said no. The defense attorney said no. I even wrote a letter to the judge, and she said no. The prosecutor said, and this is shortly after the trial ended in 2011, the sentencing was in 2012. Prosecutor said, you should file a FOIA for this trial evidence that sent a man to prison for 4 consecutive life terms. That was all shown in open court. Can't emphasize all that enough, right? Uh, I was asking for evidence shown in open court that sent a man to prison for life. That to me does not sound like a FOIA case. We're not talking about like Edward Snowden here. We're talking like basic government transparency. Open court proceedings are a pillar of our justice system. The places where they don't have open court proceedings are not places where we want to live, etc. So, I don't know if that prosecutor sent me that email with like a wink, like go file a FOIA, yuck, yuck, have fun, or he like really meant it. Whatever it was, that's what happened. And with all other doors closed to me, I filed a FOIA, February 1st, 2012. The first FOIA request I've ever filed, asking for the evidence from Volkman's, at that point, completed trial. And it didn't go well. Um, I had access to the list of the names and brief descriptions of the documents, which was accessible via FOIA. The list itself was 17 pages long, and I included the list in my request, and I summarized the list in the text of my request. I was saying, I'm asking for prescription slips, for death certificates, for autopsy reports, so on. Um, and I don't know how much detail you want me to get into, but a long story short, at first I sent it to what turned out to be the wrong place, the Executive Office of U.S. Attorneys. I figured U.S. attorneys had prosecuted him, might as well go to the mothership of U.S. attorneys. It took 9 months for them to tell me, no, this is actually a request for the DEA. A very long 9 months. And they also charged me a fee for that trouble of being told, you've actually sent this to the wrong place. So they transfer it to the
Wait, they
DEA.
charged you a fee, but they
Yes,
didn't produce any documents?
correct.
What was the fee for?
Processing? I don't know.
That's interesting. I maybe other people on this call have heard of that, but
And,
like
and and
if
all the
they
documents, I have all the I can send them to you afterward. They're all in my document cloud that shows this. So 9, 10 months after my request, February of 2012, it gets transferred to the Drug Enforcement Administration, which was the agency that investigated Volkman, and that is its proper home. And that they are the ones with whom I would engage in FOIA combat, so to speak. The DEA does not do a great job of responding to this request once they receive it. They take an exceedingly long time to comb through small portions of what I was asking for, and they withhold or redact almost the entirety of what I was asking for. So they're sending me these packages every few months that say, we've reviewed X number of pages out of 15,000 or whatever. We have determined that 80% of them can't be released. So I'm getting nothing, but I'm getting nothing very slowly. So, and this is my first experience with FOIA. Mind you, young, energetic, ambitious Phil Eil has hitched all of his career ambitions to this story. I'm thinking that this story, and this is maybe not the best thing to admit, but I'm thinking this story was my big story, my big ticket. This was my moment.
Hmm.
And I had been working on it, and I had access to the main guy, and I had been to Southern Ohio. So I'm going 60 miles an hour as I emerge from my graduate writing program right around when this FOIA request happens, and I hit a wall. So when you ask me how I took it, I didn't take it very well. I now know, and I've given this advice to other people, that it's sound advice to never ever attach emotions to the outcome of a FOIA request. I had attached almost everything to the outcome of this FOIA request because I felt I needed it, and I still believe that, to complete this story that I had, put all my eggs into that basket. So if you can at all avoid it, don't ever take a FOIA request personally or need need its swift and complete resolution for your own emotional health, that is the situation I inadvertently stumbled into as a young, very naive journalist. I learned that the hard way. So, literally years pass. I'm getting nothing from my request for the evidence that sent the guy to prison. Life happens. I get hired as the news editor of my local weekly. That's an all-consuming job for 18 months, which is fine because the story isn't going anywhere. FOIA limbo. The paper closes. I have some time to kind of regroup. At that time, I have a connection with my local ACLU and I'm kind of back to my project. And I reach out to them and say, hey, I've got this FOIA case that I'm getting the runaround on. Would you, at that point, somehow I knew that the ACLU helped with FOIA cases. And to their everlasting credit, Steve Brown of the Rhode Island ACLU heard my case, said, this sounds significant, the documents you're asking for, and it sounds like this is inappropriate, the barriers you're getting. And they took on the case, which meant that they connected me with two local pro bono attorneys. And together we put together a complaint. And in March of 2015, Sunshine Week, 3 years after my initial FOIA request, we filed a lawsuit in U.S. District Court in Rhode Island, my home state's federal district. Not the one where the crimes took place, not the one where the DEA was based. Just a fascinating fact that like if you sue under FOIA, you can kind of sue wherever, I think. And it became a lawsuit, Eil versus DEA. Never in a million years did I expect my name to be in the legal annals for taking on the DEA. 26, 27-year-old freelance journalist in Rhode Island, but that's what happened. And another mistake I made was thinking that, okay, now once the lawsuit happens, this will be settled quickly. No, like there was a lot more time to wait. And I remember my blood pressure going through the roof when like my lawyers agreed to some fairly routine extension for the DEA. And I was like, what? We're giving them more time? How is this possible? Because every day was excruciating for me. Um, and there's more to the story, but I got my proverbial day in court. After the lawsuit, we finally started. There's a lot of things that change when you move from a regular Joe or Jill requester to a FOIA litigant. I believe, in my own experience, litigation is actually where what the FOIA system, how it should work, happens. Like you are actually given reasons for why you're not getting the things. They get specific in their denials. You actually have a neutral arbiter and a judge. Because I went through all of the other pre-litigation steps, complained endlessly of the DEA, talked to the FOIA ombudsman, complained to my senators and U.S. representatives. I really went all in and like literally complained to everyone I could. It got me nowhere, except, being able to say that. It was the lawsuit that worked, and a judge ultimately ruled in my favor.
How did that feel after all that time? Were you actually in court? Was this in over telephone? What was the day
Uh,
like?
well, so at one point, in the many years that I was waiting for my FOIA results, I wound up getting really interested in the FOIA because it was the bane of my existence, and I wrote a lot about it in my capacity as a journalist, and I also wrote a lot about it in my capacity as a frustrated FOIA requester. And at one point, the House Oversight Committee, then helmed by Jason Chaffetz, was collecting FOIA stories about how FOIA is broken for a report ultimately named FOIA is broken. Um, they were trying to stick it to the Obama administration uh, for good reason. But this is one of the things that in previous times, FOIA was a partisan thing where the party that wasn't in power would use it to say, to point out how bad the party in power was. And I wrote in that letter that my experiences with FOIA were the single most disillusioning experience of my life. And I bring that up because when the judge ruled in my favor, a federal judge, John McConnell, who heard my case, who took it seriously, who wrote some lovely thoughts in the opinion about the importance of journalism, about the importance of courtroom transparency. I have described it as probably the most validating experience of my life.
Mm.
To be out alone in the cold shouting to literally anyone who listens. On Twitter at the time, I became known as like the FOIA guy who was always kind of mumbling or raving about FOIA, this obscure case nobody knew what it was about. To have that be me for years and then to have a judge say, Phil, you are right. You deserve these documents. These documents are important for the public discourse. Journalism is important. Journalism of this kind is important. I am ordering this federal agency that has withheld these documents for years to hand them over with minimal redactions. To hear that, I can't express it, how amazing that was. I was at the gym riding the stationary bike when I got an email from my lawyers. I wasn't in court at the moment. There wasn't like a dramatic moment where you could like see my reaction.
You just
Um,
rode the bike right off the machine and
yeah,
out
exactly.
into the sunset.
Um, it was incredible. It's still incredible. I have the first page of his opinion framed. It hung in my office for a while. Um, I sent him a copy of the book, and true to form, as an ethical judge, his clerk said he can't accept this as a gift, but he's going to buy a copy. So that was, I mean, Judge McConnell's a real one. He is, by the way, the same judge who has made some major decisions on Doge-related cases in Rhode Island and like paused the freezing of federal funding. So it's classic Rhode Island to like have a connection to people in the news, but I can say like, oh, that was the guy who ruled in my FOIA case, who's
Mm,
like, who ruled on cases that are making national news. It's funny.
yeah.
But there's a coda to this story, which is the DEA, as is their legal right, appealed the case and took it to the First Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals in Boston, and they won. Uh, on paper, McConnell's decision about a year later was technically overturned. And the reason I'm not despondent in a corner reporting that is because that was really a symbolic victory for them, a symbolic loss for us, because at that time, the bulk of the materials I was asking for had already been released as a result of his first decision. Also, as a result of the lawsuit in the first place. Another thing they don't teach you at FOIA school is that once you sue, the government is going to approach you with a settlement offer that is far superior, or at least in my case, to what I ever got as a requester. So I was getting documents that were helpful to me even before this thing was sorted out legally. They were
Mm.
just offering me settlements, and we accepted that the documents, but we said no, we're not settling. So by the time it was overturned, I already had a lot of really all of what I was asking for. And that material was absolutely instrumental in the writing of the book.
In We have maybe 10 or so minutes left, and then I think I'll
It's
have.
hard to it's hard to briefly summarize a FOIA battle that it took nearly 6 years to get sorted out. So I apologize if I'm.
No, it would be criminal for me to make you summarize those years in just a couple minutes. But I just want to say that for everyone listening, I have some time after two to hang on for questions. I have my own questions I want to get you to answer in the next couple minutes. As long as you have a little bit time to hang on after two. Is that good?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. So
I'm just catching up on the comments. Um,
you
yes,
get
yeah, so yeah, the very short version is I asked for trial evidence that had been shown in open court. I got denied. I had to file a FOIA. FOIA failed. Basically, I got help to sue. We sued. We won. I got the documents.
you get 20,000 documents, right, or 20,000
More
pages.
or less, yeah.
Yeah. How do you even begin to start going through that as a reporter?
Well, so the document number is somewhat misleading because a lot of those release documents were still redacted. I mean, there was useful stuff, but like there were thousands of pages of nearly identical prescription slips that the names had been redacted from, where the amounts of the medication and the type of medication was clear. what the defining de and that was fine. And I included one of those in the book. Um, I slowly and methodically I created a spreadsheet. The doc, there were multiple releases of documents over different times. So I had like, the proposed settlement, for instance, happened in two pieces, and each one came with it like a 2,000 page PDF. So I would like link to that in a spreadsheet and then like link to other partial releases that had come later on. And I would like have a color coding system, much like the one I devised for my writing progress, to say if I had looked at what was in that, and I would slowly go through and in a separate Google document take notes on what the pages were, rough notes. When things were really good or useful, I would take a screenshot, drop it into the Google Doc, and that way, slowly, I was able to process, so to speak, what was in there. And along the way, I was taking the materials in the FOIA produced documents and plugging them into other documents that I had for my reporting process. So let's say if it related to one of the deceased patients for whom I had already created a Google Doc timeline of their life events, which is how I write about most things is via Google Doc timelines. I would take the document produced by FOIA and plug it into that timeline. Or if I was writing about a particular portion of Volkman's time in Southern Ohio, for which I had a timeline document, I would take the FOIA produced document, mention it there. So it was like going through it slowly on my own and then plugging it into the existing infrastructure. Almost, I should note that this was entirely digital. None of it was printed. The stuff they sent me in response to the initial FOIA request was in print, but that was useless. Um, so yeah, it was a process of slowly, much like I slowly read the trial transcript, taking notes as I went, and then through that slow, methodical process, figured out how I was going to use this material and where I was going to use this material.
And you were happy to be swimming in material at that point.
Yeah, just to give you a sense, I mean, the real crown jewel of the FOIA production was a video exhibit that was released after my FOIA request, again, shown during trial. And this video exhibit, which lasts about half an hour, was taken on a day that the DEA raided one of Volkman's clinics and slowly walked through the entire building with a camcorder, just looking around, capturing what it looked like upstairs in the offices, in the examination room, in the lobby, downstairs. So you can imagine the value of that, where I, as a writer, am trying to take my readers inside these clinics, and here is a 30-minute video document, essentially no voiceover, just walking through the clinic as it appeared. Just invaluable for me as a writer. Um,
And
to,
that stays in my mind as a reader because I picture the clinics with the bat next to the door and the
right,
guns in the random places,
right.
just like they describe in that video. A
It,
little bit messy, receipts all over the place. Like I see that in my head clearly even now.
Another amazing document produced by FOIA was a handwritten dosage schedule given to a patient by Volkman, where this patient is scheduled to take, according to the doctor's orders, something like 30 pills a day, and he's written out different six, seven different times in the day and the pills that they're supposed to take in his own handwriting, showing for people, my readers, to understand what he was asking of these people. That's another example of the kind of thing that I got um, from the FOIA. And those are just two very small examples.
And is there anything else as we come in the last minutes, any rapid fire favorite documents or anything else you want to share with the group before we get into some questions?
I mean, Pacer was amazing. Pacer should be free for the record, but, Pacer was amazing for different reasons. I mean, for documents related to his criminal case, I accessed the transcripts and other things via Pacer. for his bankruptcy records, which were enormously helpful. He had filed for bankruptcy before his criminal stuff, years before. I found that in Illinois bankruptcy court via Pacer, where he says things like how much money he had to his name and what his previous income was, and all this helpful stuff. Pacer was also helpful because, again, separate from the Ohio region where went to trial, he was arrested in a U.S. district in Chicago. Um, and the letter I mentioned that he hand wrote to a judge asking to be released after his initial arrest was filed via Pacer. And that letter includes this remarkable thing that I include in my book and mention of he signs one of the letters, Paul Volkman, MD, PhD, inmate number so and so. And I have often mentioned that signature as like capturing the entire story I was trying to tell in microcosm. So that was a document I got via Pacer. Um, I can go on and on about, I mean, I also went to the town where his crimes took place, and there were some, or at least one local lawsuit there. And I went to the courthouse, and that had gone to a trial too, briefly, and got the records, no questions asked, basically. So it was always in my mind the kind of odd and inexplicable split between literally just showing up at the courthouse, paying some money and getting a transcript and documents and this, years long FOIA process. Um, and all of it was grist for the story. And there were also documents related to his malpractice cases. But this cost a lot of money. I mean, one thing I learned is that all reporting costs money, but justice-based reporting is especially expensive, not just for the travel involved, but just for the documents involved. I mean, for one of the medical malpractice lawsuits that went to a trial, I think I paid over $1,000 for the transcripts for that. And, I just paid it because I needed it, Um, so yeah, now another spoiler, like writing true crime is neither a get rich or quick scheme. It's neither one. I don't didn't do this for the money, and it hasn't been worth it for the money. It's worth it for a million other reasons, though.
Well, speaking of money, one of the questions that just came in
Yeah.
was from Henry, who asked, "Did you seek reimbursement of lawsuit to enforce attorney fees and related court costs? If so, what were the results?"
Well, the way it worked with the ACLU is I didn't have to pay anything. So I don't know if they got attorney fees. It was always free for me. So I didn't get any compensation there. I'm not sure if they did or not.
And with the appeal, there were no attorney fees on the line.
No, no, they covered that too. I will say that after the appeal happened, we had the choice of are we going to try to fight this to the Supreme Court? Sometimes FOIA cases go to the Supreme Court. And the ACLU understandably said, no, I think that that's enough. And I can't blame us for that. Can't blame them for that. It would have been fun to try to fight my FOIA case to the Supreme Court, but we stopped at the appellate level.
Yeah, I think if that were to happen, then you would definitely be the curmudgeonly FOIA fighter uh,
Yes, yes, yes.
for life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Does anyone else have any other questions they want to ask? If you do, you can feel free to unmute or drop it in the chat.
Thank you so much for the kind words. Um, I can talk about this now with a lot of humor and laughs. But for a long time, for the literally years, when this project was in limbo, this project I believed in deeply was in limbo for reasons that I did not believe were valid. The non-release of trial evidence based on requests, it was a lot less funny for me. Um, so I am remain immensely, immensely grateful to the Rhode Island ACLU, to my attorneys, to the judge who saw the case in, I think, a fair and accurate way, to the journalists who consoled me along the way, and in some cases, like Muckrock, wrote about the case. Um, it was an extraordinary learning experience, and I got really interested in FOIA along the way.
Um, Sarah Harvey Patrick asks, "Were you ever afraid of getting scooped?"
Well, there were moments. The short answer is no about the Volkman case specifically. I will say that Sam Quinones's excellent book Dreamland came out in 2015 and had Portsmouth, Ohio, the town where these crimes took place on the cover, and goes into significant detail about the opiate epidemic in Portsmouth, Ohio. And so there was a moment there where I felt scooped to an extent. He talked about the Volkman case briefly, but over time, and this goes for the FOIA experience generally, almost every setback that I had along the marathon journey of this project, everything that was frustrating or upsetting in the moment, almost all felt in the end like a blessing. In terms of Sam's book, because he told the broader story of the opiate epidemic, I later realized that it allowed me to focus much more specifically on this case. And the FOIA thing, although I might not tell this to the DEA, I did wind up being grateful for the delay it caused. Not because of the delay in and of itself, nor did I think it was fair or appropriate, but in the time I spent waiting for these documents, I matured as a person and got so much more experience as a journalist that was essential for me to take on this incredibly complex, heavy story that I was certainly in no way equipped to take on when I started. So I'm not going to say thank you to the DEA, but I will say that, and I wound up finding FOIA as a beat and a subject that I was quite interested in and wrote a lot about it. Um, yeah, um, so that's what I would say. I did get scooped a little bit, but on the main story, I wasn't scooped.
Yeah, and I think for me, it feels like the story you wrote had characters that probably only you could have ever written, or certainly only you could have ever written because you were one of them.
Yeah.
It's you, Volkman, the documents, and then the people who died from prescriptions from Volkman and their families. I think those are like the four main characters, and I don't think anyone
Yeah.
else could have
And
talked to
and
those
I
characters.
want to paraphrase something my friend, the great reporter Anna Clark at ProPublica in Michigan, who wrote a book about Flint, has said and told me, which is that some books, some stories like the Flint water crisis, like the opiate epidemic, are big enough that they deserve multiple takes, multiple books. And so ultimately, or pretty early on, I came to see these many other opiate books as we were all telling this enormous story, far too big to tell in one book, as kind of a group effort. And we were all taking pieces of this bigger story, a man-made crisis, I should emphasize, um, to break off. So I came to view it that way. And Anna's insight about that helped me to see it that way, that there are some stories so big that they deserve multiple books. Um, and luckily, I didn't come from a kind of cutthroat daily news environment where I approached things with a really competitive streak. It felt pretty early on that I had this piece of the story to myself.
Hmm. And then last question I want to get in here is from someone who just has the initial N on Zoom who asks, should you sue or wait to the end of the appeals process?
Um, I always emphasize that my experience with FOIA is deep, not wide. Um, I'd say if you can sue, then you should make plans for that early on and be prepared to do that. It depends on your time frame. I think you can wait for the appeals to play out if you have the time. But I think if you have the wherewithal and the resources to sue, which is a big if, because unfortunately the system often only works for people who can sue, and that makes what's supposedly a really egalitarian democratic system much less egalitarian and democratic if only the people who have the resources to sue can actually get what they're looking for. But certainly if you're on a time crunch and you expect a fight, I would be prepared to sue from early on.
And I just shared in the chat a link to a FOIA Friday on lawsuits, and specifically talking with the reporter who filed his own lawsuit, um, which is not legal advice from me or from that reporter. But you can file your own lawsuit, and that is possible. It is very difficult, and many attorneys wouldn't recommend it. But there are some times when, if the case is obvious enough, or you believe it's obvious enough, that it might be easy enough for you to file and get the documents yourself.
Hats off to that reporter. I would have never been able to navigate this myself.
Right. Um, any last thoughts? I think we can wrap it up here in a moment.
Any last thoughts?
Anything you want to share with the group? Any calls to actions? Ways to keep in touch with you?
Well, certainly anyone who has questions for me can follow up via email, social media. I'm more than happy to continue this conversation. If I could go back and give advice to myself, I mean, at some point I would like to write a book about the FOIA system. I wish I had not put so much emotional energy into this one request because I had a lot of heartache and frustration over that. Um, you know, I'm thinking of that old infomercial for like the oven that was like set it and forget it. Yeah, I think that's maybe like the best advice for a FOIA is like don't plan on the results and make tangible plans based on what's going to come in and when. I think the best way, emotionally speaking, to navigate the system is to like file the request and go do something else and do your best to distract yourself. Um, I wasn't able to do that, and so it became very painful. And I would just to the earlier question is I really think, at least for me, suing was the thing that helped. So if there's any way you can sue, I would pursue that. I wrote a piece for CJR many years back, in which I offered some takeaways from my story, one of which was like the days of FOIA innocence, if they ever existed, are over. You need to lawyer up.
Hmm.
So that would be some of my advice.
Well, thank you so much, Phil. It's been a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you
Hopefully,
for
we'll
having
have
me.
you
Thank you.
sometime soon
Uh,
again, especially when you start working on the book about the FOIA system in general. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about
Something else has
then.
jumped into the queue before that, but I would like to write it at some point. Thank you so much to you, Dylan, to Muck Rock, and to everyone who joined. I really appreciate it. Feel free to reach out to me via email or social media. I'm happy to talk more.
All right. Thanks, y'all. See you next month.
Thank you.